joining us for this webinar, Attracting, Retaining and Keeping Your Employees Engaged. For those that don't know me, my name's Antonio Fletcher, and I'm head of the employment team here at Whitehead Moncton. And I'm joined, first of all, by my colleague Veronica Fox, who's our senior HR consultant at sister company Eclipse HR. And also we have the absolute pleasure today of being joined by Helen Lawson of Wellbeing Training Solutions to give us some insights from her side of things. So without further ado, I think Veronica is going to kick us off here. So I will go on mute and Veronica, over to you.
Thank you very much, Antonio, and good afternoon to you all. Well, certainly I think we all want to make sure that we look at how we work, how to make work in 2024 and in the future. And we very much are, all of us, hoping for less turbulence everywhere during this year. It's certainly been an interesting few years for organisations, for employees and for all of us personally. No denying that 2023 was also a difficult year for businesses for many reasons, many external factors. But it's also recognised that businesses perform best against competitors will be those that are more skilled and more resilient in terms of their workforce. So just in terms of tipping points, there have been some interesting reviews, statistics that I thought was worth sharing today. Just in terms of Generation Z are set to surpass boomers in the workforce. The youngest generation is now the fastest generation workforce segment. Office for National Statistics data showed that a record number of over 50s were in the UK working part-time, and that's certainly something for us to consider both now and going forward. And even before the pandemic, there were more women aged 50 and above in the workplace than ever before. So I think if we can all cast our minds back to us when we joined the workforce, whenever that was, that's something for us that will definitely develop as the years progress. And only this week, very topical, the International Longevity Centre has warned the UK is likely to increase its state pension age to 71 by 2050. So that's certainly something that we may or may not be looking forward to. So the skills requirements are definitely changing rapidly. The World Economic Forum describes this as the new era of turbulence for businesses. I think there seems to be turbulence all round. But for the workplace, the push and pull between employee and the employer continues. So looking at it from a people management perspective, there was a big concentration on the Great Resignation not so long ago, but has that now really been replaced by the big stay movement for now? I do think the economic situation is actually focusing employees on potentially staying more than resigning. In terms of what employers should do to understand the common themes, that's definitely something at the forefront of our minds. And in terms of what people value, most dislike, like about their job, like about their organisation, or not so much, there's a lot of employee data that's generated directly from employees. So that's certainly something that I'd recommend that we all consider. Onboarding surveys, employment engagement surveys, and exit interviews, all valuable sources of information. And understanding what brings skills and activity that's needed for growth. It's very much the people are the core of the business. All of the industries that we have in attendance today, our people really are core. And key employee development areas has been flagged as flexibility, very important in terms of communication skills. There's much more of a need now for conflict resolution, and I know that Antonio, Helen and I have certainly seen that from a professional capacity. And also work ethic is really, really strong and core to individuals. Leadership skills are absolutely paramount in the marketplace, and also we need to be organised with our skills as well. Creativity is certainly the forefront of how we need to look going forward, and not forgetting stress management is something that we really need to be robust with, looking after our people. And just going back there, Antonio, please. Thank you. So regardless of whether it's the Great Resignation or if it's the Big Stay movement, I think the McKinsey research is definitely something for us to bear in mind, that more than 50% employees leave because of their managers. So that's certainly food for thought. And I thought that was perhaps something for us to bear in mind when we're equipping our leaders to support the employees that they have. Whether what it really means to be an employer of choice. That's certainly something that I've heard that's been mentioned. Some organisations have accreditation around that. Best workplaces, it's either a list or they're certified, or others look at it in another way. But I certainly would say that in terms of being an employer of choice, the employer brand is most important. The reputation of the employer is absolutely paramount. We all live in a county that, whereas it's large, people talk. So in terms of reputation, that's so important. Opportunity to grow and how that means it could be a multitude of ways that we develop that. We all are looking for more so of a work-life balance, and that's certainly something that as the generations progress, that is a focus for them. And also employee well-being, and Helen will touch upon that more in a moment as well. Another area that we're all finding out in terms of a focus, not just for internationally and nationally, but in terms of environmental, social and governance. These are all areas that actually really matter to employees and to the employer, and that's certainly something that we're finding that employees, whether they're considering staying or actually looking at elsewhere within the marketplace, that they will give that further consideration. So to support and empower your managers, focus here could look at highlighting in terms of driving inclusivity, treating all employees with respect, and supporting their development and facilitating a platform for their voice. Well, that goes without saying, but how do we do that? We work to highlight and remove bias, recognise awareness of cultural and religious holidays, look at diversity and equality, training for managers and employees, have clear diversity and inclusive policies, ensure equal pay for equal work, and also write inclusive job adverts. I don't know how many of you have seen some interesting job adverts out in the marketplace. I know probably because of my profession, I raise a few eyebrows where sometimes they're completely off the mark. And that often comes from many industries and many sectors. Increase in retention. One area we could look at is actually are individuals quietly quitting? Have the noisy workforces, I know Antonia probably be the first to say that I'm quite a chatter, have they actually become quite quiet? So are they quietly quitting? It's really important to improve and strengthen internal communications, have fair career progression, appreciate culture. We're all different and that's what makes the world go round, and isn't that great? Offering flexible working. Antonio will talk to you around the flexible working changes that are imminent, but actually what does that really mean to the employee, listening to your employees around their flexible working needs. Really important to look at employees when you onboard them, but as much so as when they're exiting the business, because again, their well-being is as important as the person joining you. And also the other area that we often hear about is workplace technology. Is that really assisting or is that hindering? So again, a lot of things for us to consider. And in terms of what motivates and building a high performance culture, leaders who inspire and motivate their workforce. Employees feel empowered and engaged, and what that means is they're retained. So teams are very much built on a strong mindset. What does that mean for us? Again, just to reinforce communication, setting values and behaviours that really reflect your mission and your vision, and actually how you do business. Performance management is really key, and also career development that I touched upon earlier. So from that perspective, an engaged, supported, empowered employee does increase performance and productivity. And my last area to look at is the recruitment. And given the situation with the current labour market, good recruitment is vital. It's very tight out there. We're very aware that it's very hard to get good candidates, and actually the good candidates are out there. They're resourced very quickly. But it's only results in resourcing the right candidate for your organisation, but also for the role itself. it really does. When that person comes on board, it doesn't just impact them, but it impacts their team and the wider organisation through morale within the workplace. It strengthens the company culture, and actually it actively retains and engages the workforce. And again, we only had that discussion in the office recently around how that actually reflects on the businesses and the clients that we're supporting at the moment. You are no doubt looking to understand constantly the job market, what those trends are, what the preferences are, expectations of your target candidates, touching on the tipping points that I mentioned earlier. They will constantly be aspects that you'll consider. Company culture, positive, diverse and appealing culture really showcases the identity and the purpose. And that can come in many guises, including your social media, your websites, how people talk about you as a client, how people talk about you as a connection, how your staff and actually former staff as well. Competitive remuneration packages, whilst they are it's the most costly aspect for an employee, that's both the monetary but also the non-monetary. And I talked about the environment, the social and the governance, but very much with the ESG, it's those non-monetary rewards that actually we're finding that employees benefit from and appreciate more so. Continue with the effective communication because it helps to attract and retain the talent. The candidates themselves, the external and internal, but also the experience for that individual, for you all as an employer, and just to continue to upskill, providing training and development opportunities to expand an employee's abilities and minimise skills gaps. And before I pass on to Helen, if we look at the more mature workforce, as I like to refer to them, myself being one, in terms of what that might look like in terms of part-time work, flexible work, for the skills that might be needed for the future, there's an opportunity here for us to retain those that are moving forward in their career, to support those that are embracing and have a bright career ahead of them. So thank you for listening. I will pass you over to Helen.
Lovely. Thanks, Veronica. And I would say that having listened to everything that Veronica has just said, you will see the same sorts of messages echoed throughout my presentation as well. And I start with a slide about the 4 key tenets of wellbeing, or specifically in this case, we're actually looking at workplace wellbeing, because wellbeing doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. And it's really useful to have a structure to understand what does wellbeing mean in the workplace. And the reason this is so important is because, as you can see, we talk here about the physiological side of wellbeing in the workplace. That's the stuff that you'll already be looking after, hopefully, the health and safety stuff, the display screen equipment assessments, all the things that keep the body of the individual in your workplace safe and able to do their job well. Aside from that, we also have the fiscal side of things, which again, Veronica has talked about. But the fiscal side of somebody's well-being obviously is really important, particularly at a time now when we have got a crisis for many people in terms of affordability, things that 6 months or a year ago they were quite well able to afford and now not so much. And so you might find that in some areas, one way people try and deal with that is that they might talk about leaving, and then perhaps a negotiation begins. So I'll just urge some caution around that, because in terms of well-being, it does set a precedent, and it does give people the idea that perhaps the only way to look after their fiscal well-being, their financial side of things, is to maybe threaten to leave and see whether that can possibly be a way to negotiate something better. So from the point of view of looking after the well-being of your people, it can be really beneficial just to be constantly reassessing, are people being paid at the right level? Are we seeing equality and fairness across the way people are being paid? And these 2 elements of well-being, we're not going to talk about too much more. The rest of the session is going to concentrate, from my point of view, much more on the psychological and the societal elements of well-being. And these are parts which can sometimes be more neglected. In terms of health and safety, the physiological stuff, we know that has to be dealt with because it's legislated for. So that tends to get done, and everybody gets a contract when they start, and it says what they'll be paid. So the fiscal side of things tends to be done. But the bits that are kind of a little bit behind often are the psychological and societal. And for those of you like me who, Veronica very nicely said, the more mature members of the audience will know that perhaps when you started work, like when I started work, what we encountered much more was a workplace where it was a lot about command and control, where you had a small number of people making a large number of decisions about everybody else. But the workforce has moved on and they want more than that. They really do expect their psychological well-being to be looked after, and they want to get something societal out of it as well. So we'll move on to the next slide and take a look at what that might look like. So you may be familiar with the expression psychological safety, and that term was first coined in the 1960s, but at the time psychological safety was sort of viewed as something fairly individual. And then an occupational psychologist, Amy Edmondson, came along and she started talking much more about team psychological safety. So there was an article written, and the description of team psychological safety is that it is a shared belief held by members of a team that it's okay to take risks, to express their ideas and their concerns, to speak up with questions, and to admit mistakes, all without fear of negative consequences. And as Amy Edmondson puts it, it's felt permission for candour. And this is something which, if any of you have ever worked in an environment where you don't feel those things, you will know how debilitating that can be. And it is almost the death knell for an organisation to not have psychological safety, team psychological safety, because team psychological safety is the thing that allows people to perform at their best without fear. So when we think about team psychological safety, what we need to recognise is that people who work in an environment where they have it tend to be less defensive. They tend to be much more focused on accomplishing their goals rather than just protecting themselves and looking to prevent problems. Because if we're always looking to prevent problems, we're really not taking risks that perhaps we need to be taking. And so it's really important to understand that team psychological safety affects team performance, and team performance affects organisational performance. So psychological safety within a team is absolutely vital, but we don't necessarily always recognise what it means, but we can see the impact of it. So for example, if you have good team psychological safety, you will recognise that you've got improved engagement, motivation, decision making, and a better learning culture where people are looking to constantly learn to improve their performance. But if you have poor team psychological safety, you're quite likely to discover that you will have poor employee well-being. That means absenteeism, presenteeism, stress, burnout. And obviously, Veronica touched on this already, that can become a reputational issue and a big reputational issue. So we really want to understand, how do we know this? Is this evidence-based or is this just a nice idea? Well, Amy Edmondson's work comes very much from an evidence base, and she started out by looking at teams who reported lots of errors. And she started on the assumption that teams who don't report many errors are the really well-functioning teams. And this work was all done in hospitals. But actually what she found is that the best performance came from teams who reported lots of mistakes. And they reported lots of mistakes because they felt allowed, comfortable, were given the permission to do so without fear of repercussion. And when you can say, yes, I've made a mistake, everybody can learn from that. Whereas if you're desperately clutching onto the idea that you're in danger if you admit a mistake, then you are, truly, you will feel threatened by that. So we're looking at people to be in an environment where when something goes wrong, their employer is more likely to ask the question, what can you learn from this experience and what can we do differently, rather than what went wrong, and puts somebody in a position of accountability or blame. That's not where we want to be. This helps everybody to learn, to move on, and it avoids a paralysis setting in, which can stop people from performing at their best. So we're then going to move on to look at how do you establish whether you might have a good level of psychological safety within your environment. Well, Amy Edmondson, again, this has been her life's work really, and she asks 7 questions, and you can present these 7 questions to your organisation. But just for now, I'm going to ask you to think about the answers to these questions for yourself. So the first question is, if you make a mistake on this team, it is not held against you. Then members of this team are able to bring up problems and tough issues. People on this team sometimes accept others for being different. And I would suggest that the word sometimes might need consideration. We don't want to say always, because if different is bad, then we don't want it. But if different is just individual differences, people should be accepted for that. We shouldn't have a homogenous group of people working together. It is safe to take a risk on this team. It isn't difficult to ask other members of the team for help. No one on this team would deliberately act in a way that undermines my efforts. And this is a really interesting one, number 6, because if you have a structure in place that pits people against each other in terms of their performance, instead of recognising individual differences, that can be quite dangerous, because all of a sudden it becomes each for themselves environment rather than everybody working towards a collective goal, which is much more where we want to be. And the 7th and final question that Amy Edmondson asks is, working with members of this team, my unique skills and talents are valued and utilised. Often we want to work with people who are like ourselves because there is an element of comfort there, but it isn't often what will bring the best results for a team, and it's certainly not what will bring the best results for an organisation. So the degree to which people feel psychologically safe can be established by asking these questions, but more importantly, it can be established by looking at the variance between the answers to these questions. Because if the variance is very significant, and some people are saying, yes, I feel psychologically safe and all is well, and other people are saying, no, I don't, then that suggests you don't have the foreground or the foundation there for psychological safety, for team psychological safety. There is something there that is a mismatch. So that might need to be looked at. And what you can do about that is to be really clear with people about the fact that there will be predictable outcomes for things. We don't ever want people thinking, if I make this mistake, there will be a different consequence for me than if somebody else makes that mistake. As a line manager, we want people to be predictable and to be open to the fact that people will admit mistakes. We need there to be predictability, that expectations are really clearly set for people, and that when they do speak up, there will be an appreciation for them speaking up, that they'll be listened to, supported, and that they will be really appreciated and respected for the fact that they have spoken up and admitted to things or asked questions or challenged the norm. And all of that can sometimes be misconstrued by people thinking that psychological safety is something about niceness. It isn't about niceness. In fact, really nice organisations often have a problem with candour, because people don't want to be honest if that honesty isn't seen as being nice. So when we talk about psychological safety, it's not about a nice environment. And it's not about a comfortable environment. Being honest and speaking up are things which require some bravery, some vulnerability, and they also really require people to put themselves out there a little bit. But they can do that if they know that there will not be unfair consequences for it. So after you leave us today, perhaps you'd like to go away and think about these 7 questions. Think about what sort of answers you might get within your organisation if you were to ask them. Would they be answers that you would want to receive? And we're going to move on now to take a little look at what is it that drives trust and psychological safety amongst people then. Well, it's the organisational climate to start with. The organisational climate is closely related to culture, but it's a little bit different. It needs to be about diversity and inclusion climate, as Veronica's already touched on. And we want the climate to feel that it is a psychologically safe environment. We want people to feel that they're part of the decision-making process. We want them to feel empowered to speak up if there are suggestions they've got about how things might improve. We also then want them to think about leadership and people management. Now, in my work, certainly, There's been a huge drive lately. I see more and more organisations coming to me for leadership training. And that leadership training is often about inclusive leadership, and it is about leadership that really gives people psychological safety. Because gone are the days where being a manager was enough. There is a distinction between being a manager who tends to be task focused and you're given the title, and a leader who is somebody who inspires and motivates and brings people with them and creates an environment where people feel comfortable and happy to speak out, to speak up, and to deliver their very best. We also need to ensure that there is an organisational feeling, a vibe, if you like, that there is fairness and that conflict management will be dealt with appropriately. If two people are doing the same job, they ought to be getting the same rewards, largely speaking. If people are applying for promotions, we need to be making sure that there are no biases coming in on that. But to be fair to many managers, and not all, but in some organisations, people will be promoted into positions because they know their stuff. In order to be a brilliant leader, you need to know your stuff, although often that stuff isn't the same stuff as when you get into the promotion as it was in the role that you started in. But we also need them to know themselves and to have that self-awareness and emotional intelligence. And we need them to know, or at least want to get and try to get to know their staff so they know what makes them tick and that they can apply this fairness across people in a self-aware fashion. Then there is the stuff about the team tenure. Teams are always at different phases. Newly formed teams often get on brilliantly because they are in that phase where it's all new and it's all shiny and they're getting along great. But then over a period of time, what can happen is that the cracks begin to show as they get more familiar with each other. Differences in values and working styles and maybe work ethics begin to appear, and then tensions can start to grow. So as an organisation, what you can do for those teams is help them to understand those phases that they'll go through and to manage them as well as they possibly can, which might require additional training or support. But very often with these things, just knowing that this might be the root of the problem, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be forever, can support people with their psychological safety in that they know it's a phase and they know they can deal with it, and then they'll come out the other side. And the final aspect here is about personal characteristics. And really what we're talking about here is that people are different. And so some people will trust much more easily than others. And if they do, they might arrive at a position of psychological safety much more quickly than other people do. And that's great for them. But then what are you going to do about those people who need a bit more time? What different strategies do you need to employ with them in order to support them to reach a place of psychological safety and trust? So there is something about the individual, but there is also something about the organisation and the behaviours that people see modelled and what they think that means for them. As we move on to our next slide then, let's take a look at what that really means in terms of what you as an organisation can expect if you do get to the point of good psychological safety with your people. Well, compared with people at low trust companies, people at high trust companies report the following. 74% less stressed. Now, I just want you to imagine a workforce that are 74% less stressed. What would that look like for you? What would that look like for your organisation? I imagine that an awful lot of tensions would be removed. 106% more energy at work. 50% higher productivity. 13% fewer sick days. And I find it interesting that that's the lowest statistic because it's almost the most easily measured thing. So perhaps it's a case that people's willingness to take a sick day is lower because they know that that will be noticed. But these other things, discretionary effort, where people decide to go over and above and therefore have higher productivity and greater energy at work, are things that they know are slightly trickier to measure. And as a result, they think they will go unnoticed. you can end up with 76% more engagement. We're talking about attracting, retaining, and engaging people. 76% more engagement can make an enormous difference to an organisation as people feel that they're really part of something that they want to help be a success. 29% more satisfaction with their lives. If anybody is under the misapprehension that psychological safety at work only matters at work, you only need to have been a person who's been unhappy at work or known somebody who's unhappy at work to know what a massive difference it makes in your whole life. Those Sunday night scaries, for example, but also that feeling of doom that some people get if they are in an environment with a line manager, for example, where psychological safety doesn't feel like it is the be all and end all. And then 40% less burnout. We often get burnout and stress mixed up. And just to be clear, stress is something that a lot of people encounter, and it tends to keep us on a really high level of alert, and we keep working and working. There are 12 steps to burnout. And when you get towards the later steps of burnout, actually, you will see the exact opposite of the stress. You will get towards the point where people are thoroughly disengaged, where their energy is so depleted that they no longer think they can do anything that they were capable of once more. So hopefully we can see from this, and this is from some work done on neuroscience, we can see that this psychological safety has real and tangible benefits. And we're now going to take a look at our next slide. And on that next slide, we will explore a little bit here about 3 things, just to wrap up, which are things that have been found to be fairly ubiquitous among different types of work, different ages of people at work, and also through people's attitudes. We see these things being consistently important. This information was pulled out by, again, organisational psychologists, but it was pulled from a survey done with Facebook employees. And those Facebook employees, as they answered a series of questions, the survey's done twice a year, the constants that they found were that the things that were important to people were, first and foremost, represented in that top left-hand corner, is career. People want to know that there is somewhere for them to go. They want to know that they will be able to make progress and that that progress will be fair and equitable. The second picture, and on here it's the biggest picture, represents the fact that people really want community from their work. And they want community because community is what we all feel we need at our cores. We are tribal individuals. So we might be an individual, but we know in our ancestral being that's stuck right in the root of our brain that if we aren't part of a tribe, and if our ancient ancestors were kicked out of a tribe, we knew that was the end of us, really, because we could not survive alone. And that's still hardwired into us, which is why social isolation and loneliness are now recognised to be as detrimental to your health as smoking 10 cigarettes a day. On average, somebody who experiences social isolation and loneliness will cut 10 years off their life. And a lot of people's societal community feel comes from their work. And comes in there also some problems around our hybrid working situations and remote working. But there is a saying about everybody needing one good friend at work. And that's a huge part of what people come to work for, even if they don't realise it. And the third picture, what you do matters, is that in addition to career, in addition to community, people really want cause. They want to come to work for something. They want to be part of something. They want to believe that what they do individually matters. It's like the old story you may have heard about the President of the United States visiting NASA in the 1960s and asking somebody what their job was. And that person replied, "My job is to get the first man on the moon, sir." That man's job was that he was a cleaner at NASA. But it was so important to him to be part of a higher level of control, to understand why what he did was so important, that he thought of his job as being the support function to get that first man on the moon. And that's my last slide, really, to wrap up by saying that, yes, we've got lots of statistics. Yes, we've got lots of research. We've got lots of evidence. But actually, if you want to do something really meaningful for people, you can probably wrap it up with these three things as a great starting point and use them as your basis to start looking at your culture and what you can do for people to give them the psychological safety to ensure that you can attract the next generation, retain them, and really importantly, engage them in everything you do. And at that point, I'm going to hand over to Antonio.
Thank you so much, Helen, and thank you, Veronica, ahead of her. That was really very, very insightful. I really enjoyed listening to that that discussion, particularly around the creation of a team and a psychologically safe working environment. I think it's so important to have that within a workplace. Because of our slightly rushed start, I omitted to say, if you do have any questions for any of us, please do put them in the chat or the Q&A, and I'm hoping that we will have a little bit of time at the end to answer those. So please do, if anything arose from Veronica's and Helen's presentations there that you'd like to ask a couple of questions on, please do type them in. And likewise, if you have any questions now, just sort of coming from this segment, where I'm just going to talk a bit about some of the changes that are coming into law, or have very recently come into law, that reflect a recognition, let's say, by the government for, whatever motivation you want to attribute to that, but around the fact that well-being, and particularly well-being at work and around work, are key issues and are recognised as key societal issues at the moment. Just before I embark on that, I also wanted to just reflect back on what Veronica and Helen had said, and apply a couple of legal principles to some of the points that they had made, or see how actually the points that they had made not only translate to the well-being or the human resources management, practical management side of things, but how actually they're quite important in law as well. One point that Veronica made in her conversation actually was very interesting, around job adverts and how those are construed and interpreted, and the risks that are associated with getting those wrong. It's not only the risk of bringing the wrong person into your business, or worse still, making someone feel like they can't apply, who would be ideal for your business or your organization at this point in time, because something within the wording of the reference puts them off. But actually there are very clear legal consequences about what you put in a reference, particularly under discrimination law. And I say this when I reflect back on my career, was a very, very early stages of my career, was shortly after age discrimination legislation came to be. One of our clients was involved in litigation that lasted several years, went all the way through to the Employment Appeal Tribunal, and it was on the basis of a job advert, and it was a professional candidate who had applied for the job and had been rejected, and she, in essence, used the wording of the job advert to pursue claims, and now this individual happened to be a serial litigator who was doing this for reasons that were found to be vexatious by both the tribunal and the EAT, and so was unable to benefit from that. But if you apply that to the context of an individual who is genuinely looking for work and applies for a role and is rejected on the basis of a characteristic like their age, then the wording of a job reference can be very important for that sort of thing. So a very easy legal example arising from misuse of these kind of HR practices, and then picking up on something Helen had said around the safety of feeling able to report mistakes and discuss mistakes and errors that you make. Well, if I think about data protection law and the way that that has developed in recent years since GDPR and the new Data Protection Act, the very tight time limits that organisations face to report data breaches to the ICO, for which failure to comply with those rules is can be quite expensive and certainly detrimental to an organisation's reputation. Well, they're all very dependent on individuals having feeling safe enough to say, oh, I've sent this email to the wrong email address, or this has happened, and that needs to happen very quickly. And for that to happen very quickly, you need people to feel safe and empowered to report those mistakes. So these principles apply very much to multiple aspects of people's working lives, and are very important from an organisational perspective to make sure that you don't find yourself in a situation where you're not complying with various legal requirements. So just to make those couple of points. So talking about family-friendly legislative updates, so the first one to flag was around the paternity leave amendment regulations 2024. Paternity leave has been quite restrictive in terms of the rules surrounding it over the years. So we had a move away towards shared parental leave several years ago now. The take up on that is still low, albeit I think it is increasing year on year. So that is showing at least some confidence in partners taking shared parental leave. But the basic core paternity leave rules have always been very restrictive in terms of only allowing a couple of weeks of leave within the first 56 days of birth, and sometimes that's not the most helpful time to have offers to support your partner, to support your new child. With these new rules are coming into effect from the 8th of March, but bizarrely only apply to children expected to be born after the 6th of April. So it allows the leave now to be taken in 1 week blocks, and that's during the first year of the child's birth. It's still not a huge entitlement, if you like. Clearly, as organisations, you can choose to enhance that, offer employees more leave, etc., if you wanted to. But it's giving a bit more flexibility to families to recognise actually it's not necessarily right at the beginning and all in one go where it's beneficial to take that leave. Secondly was the Protection from Redundancy, Pregnancy and Family Leave Act 2023, and I think this is a really important one. From the 6th of April 2024, pregnant employees will receive additional safeguards to their employment for an 18-month protection period against redundancy, and this includes the established obligation on employers to grant them first priority for any alternative roles that arise in redundancy situations whilst individuals are on leave. Now, this is I think firstly very beneficial because quite often I've certainly seen over the years there's circumstances where a woman has protection whilst she is pregnant, has protection whilst she is on maternity leave, but perhaps the most vulnerable time is at the point or shortly after the point where the woman returns from maternity leave and finds themselves potentially in an alien working environment and doesn't benefit from the protection that she had. Changes happen naturally in organisations over the course of a year, let's say, or perhaps more if it's a longer maternity leave period plus some holidays. So some of that change is natural, but it's also important to recognise that employers still have obligations to look after their employees, to still make sure that relevant consultation happens at the relevant point in time, regardless of whether someone is on maternity leave or otherwise, and springing surprises on individuals on their return from maternity leave is not a particularly fair thing to do, let's say, and therefore enhancing this protection. So the 18-month period, let's say if someone were to take a full 12 months of maternity leave, this ensures that for 6 months after the individual has returned to work or has finished their maternity leave, that they will still have protection and safeguards, including the first priority rule for redundancy. Neonatal Care Leave and Pay Act, and this isn't quite into force yet. This will be next year. So employees will be provided with up to 12 weeks paid leave if their child of age 28 days or under requires a hospital stay over 7 days. Certainly, speaking from the perspective of someone who took paternity leave and had one of our children was in neonatal care for the first week of her life, the leave that is available to you is quickly hoovered up, and again going back to not being used in the best possible way. So the fact that in future people will also be able to benefit from this type of leave as well is, I think, very beneficial, and also serves to protect the other rights, for example, around paternity leave that people will have. Looking at some further key legislative changes relating to employee wellbeing that will come into force from the 6th of April. So there's the carers leave regulations. So employees who provide long-term care to a dependent will be entitled to take unpaid leave ranging from half a day to a maximum of 1 week block to assist with caring for the dependent. That can be taking them to appointments or general at-home care should someone need that. And perhaps the one that's had the most discussion around it in recent months is the Employment Relations Flexible Working Act 2023, which Veronica mentioned briefly as well. So employees will now have the right to request flexible working arrangements from the first day of their employment. That's quite a shift from the service-based requirements that were in place before, and will be interesting to see how that develops in months to come. I think it certainly recognises the value that people place on flexibility and flexible working arrangements, be it in terms of their place of work, their hours, etc. And it will be interesting to see how many people with very short service do take that up. That there's probably a psychological barrier in many people's mind of thinking, well, actually, am I going to start a job on specified agreed terms with a new employer, and sort of a week or less down the line suddenly make a flexible working request and ask for hours, etc., to be varied. It will be interesting to see how that develops. To be honest, I'm not sure it's going to be quite as revolutionary as perhaps people expect, but it does show that some recognition, at least, that that flexibility and the need to, if you like, encompass your working life into your wider life is certainly gain traction and receiving recognition in law now as well. And as part of this, there's also a shorter 2-month period during which the employer would need to respond to that sort of request, and must now explicitly consult with the employee prior to refusing their request as well, which again, it's all to reinforce the importance with which that is viewed, I would say. And then finally, the Workers' Predictable Terms and Conditions Act 2023, new statutory right for anyone engaged with a business on a part-time basis to request a predictable working pattern if they work irregular hours. And again, this is clearly aimed at giving people a bit more balance in their life, certainty as to when they're expected to work. And I'm sure it certainly will contribute to people's psychological well-being in having that degree of certainty, and not being expected to be called upon too last minute or too unpredictably, so they can't make plans in the future. And this will include workers on 0 hours contracts, agency workers, or those working core hours, which can be varied by the business's needs. Just a quick note on holiday pay updates as well. Much of this doesn't particularly touch on our subject matter for today, but it's important to notify that, for example, the carryover of leave rules, they have now clearly brought into domestic law the principles that we had within our law that derived from the EU, allowing carryover where individuals have been prevented from taking leave due to sickness, absence, maternity, or other family-related leave, etc. So just to remove any ambiguity as to whether those rules would continue to apply. And then equally, carryover of leave is also allowed when employee has not been given the opportunity to take leave over the course of the previous leave year, or one to note, I think, has not been advised of use it or lose it principles. A lot of employers now do sort of rely on use it or lose it when it comes to individuals' holiday, and only allow carryover in specific circumstances required by law. But it's important to make clear to people that if they don't use it, they do lose it, because otherwise that is potential grounds for an employee to say, well, hang on, you didn't tell me that. Allow me to carry over my holiday, please. And the third point, again, this is the one that most of this new legislation or new guidance has got the headlines for, but it's for holiday years starting after the 1st of April 2024. We're reverting back to the case, to the legal principles that essentially derived from case law before this case, known as Harbour Trust and Brezil, particularly relevant for schools and other educational establishments that don't have employees working throughout the year, that have term time only staff, or other people that have 0 hours contracts and people working for only limited parts of the year. The calculation of holiday entitlement is now from holiday years after the 1st of April 2024, going back to the old calculation that most people used of 12.07% of actual hours worked in the pay period. What this may well mean in practice, and links to another change within these regulations, is that people who do work very casual hours will get an extra bit of pay for holiday, as rolled up holiday pay, which was previously not allowed. And I think that just makes the relationship and the arrangement around holiday more manageable for those organisations with casual workers. And then finally, sort of hot off the press last week, some guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission around menopause at work. There was lots of talk, looking back a year, 18 months ago, whether menopause would potentially be afforded its own protected status in the same way as maternity has, for example, under equality legislation. In essence, what the HRC has reaffirmed is the protection exists already under protected characteristics of age and sex. If menopause symptoms have a long-term and substantial impact on a woman's ability to carry out day-to-day activities, they may be considered to be a disability. So that would be a third limb of protection under the equality and discrimination law. So whilst menopause hasn't been afforded its own status as a characteristic in the same way as maternity, it's important to be very mindful of the fact that protection does exist for those going through the menopause. And the guidance also sets out some obligations for employers. So they reminded employers of the need to conduct workplace risk assessments. Clearly, that's part of all employers' health and safety duties and duties to provide a safe working environment for staff. So in the same way as you may revisit those for individuals who are pregnant, for example, you may wish to consider whether there needs to be risk assessments that are revised also for people going through menopause. It's also important to be mindful of the duty to make reasonable adjustments to working conditions, and especially where an individual is considered to be disabled under the Equality Act 2010. So if you do have an employee who has long-term and substantial impacts as a result of being on the menopause, they may be disabled, and that may well trigger a legal obligation to make reasonable adjustments to working conditions. And then protection under the equality in respect of all protected characteristics includes protection from both direct and indirect discrimination, as well as from harassment and victimisation. So clearly there were various examples. I was listening to a phone-in on the day that this guidance was published, and lots of examples of things that you don't actually think happen in workplaces in 2024, but sadly name calling, etc., is still unfortunately rife in some places. So it's very important, that employers not only do the more complex things right in terms of health assessments and things like that, but also actually do the basics right and make sure that people aren't just being overtly horrible to each other. So that brings us to an end of our talk today. Having said that, I was hoping that we would have a little bit of time for questions. I've now taken us slightly beyond our time limit. So if you do have any questions, please do send them through to us. We'll be very happy to take those offline. And it just remains to me to say, well, firstly, thank you all for joining us, and a special thanks for Helen for giving us her knowledge and insights today. Very welcome. And hopefully we will speak to you soon, and join us on another webinar in the weeks ahead. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.